cry, and we all must cry together that we want our freedom and we want it now.
Fighting for freedom for all.
We believe at rock bottom that the solution to our problems are moral.
And putting their own lives at risk while doing so.
You understood from the get-go that you could be killed at any given moment.
For decades, they led the charge, pushing for equality and striving to make our country a better place. Now, with the passing of 3 civil rights pioneers, it's time to pass the torch.
So don't get weary. Yes. Keep the faith.
Yes. Yes. There's no more single important thing to do than to remove racism from American culture.
I'm grateful. I've lived to see so many things that come to pass that I never dreamed I would live to see.
Tonight, we are celebrating Atlanta's freedom fighters, fathers of the movement.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us. I'm Jovita Moore.
And I'm Fred Blankenship. Jovita, what an important and special evening this is. It's a time to honor the lives and legacies of 3 of Atlanta's freedom fighters, Reverend C.T. Vivian and Joseph E. Lowry, and Congressman John Lewis. Reverend Vivian and Congressman Lewis passed away on Friday, and John Lewis's message was one of nonviolence.
He led a long life of fighting for civil and human rights, a life that included 34 years of defending the gains he helped secure for Black Americans.
Hate is too heavy a burden to bear.
A civil rights icon, an advocate, Georgia Representative John Lewis dedicated his life to protecting human rights and building a country for everyone.
The full story of America cannot and will not be told until we tell the story of the history and contribution that African Americans have made.
Lewis and his siblings grew up on this farm near Troy, Alabama. His father was a sharecropper, and as a boy, he quickly noticed that life was different for people who looked like him.
I saw how my father, my uncles, my grandparents, and others were being treated. I saw the signs that said white, colored. White men, colored men, white women, colored women. They go downtown to the little town of Troy on a Saturday afternoon to the theater. All of us little black children had to go upstairs to the balcony, and all of the little white children went downstairs to the first floor. I would come home and ask my mother, ask my father, my grandparents why, and they would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble.
The radio introduced Lewis to the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., words that ignited a fire inside of him. It inspired him to join the movement.
And I was deeply inspired by this man. He inspired me. It seemed like he was saying to me, John Lewis, you too can do something. You can make a contribution.
Lewis wrote a letter to Dr. King.
Wrote me back, sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket, and invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. I didn't tell my mother, my father, any of my sisters or brothers, any of my teachers that I sent this letter to Dr. King. And I saw Dr. King and Reverend Ralph Abernathy standing behind a desk in a little office. And Dr. King said, are you the boy from Troy? Are you John Lewis? I was so scared. I said, Dr. King, I'm John Robert Lewis. I gave my whole name. I'm John Robert Lewis. And he started calling me the boy from Troy. And during that time, we became like brothers.
Lewis devoted himself to the movement, joining the Freedom Riders, civil rights activists who worked to integrate bus terminals across the South. While a student at Fisk University, Lewis organized sit-in demonstrations to integrate the lunch counters in Nashville.
We live in a different America, a better America.
A better America because of the movement that was building, a movement that often ended with Lewis getting spat on, beaten, arrested, and jailed. Lewis would go on to lead the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, Later, he helped plan the 1963 March on Washington, joining other leaders in meetings with the president, John F. Kennedy.
This was the first meeting to plan the march. This is the Big Six. This meeting took place on July 2nd, 1963 at the Commodore Hotel in New York.
A picture of that meeting was on display in his Atlanta office during my interview with the Congressman in 2011. Lewis was the youngest speaker at that historic march.
It is true that we support the administration's civil rights bill. We support it with great reservation, however. Unless Title III is put in this bill, there's nothing to protect the young children and old women who must face police dogs and fire hoses in the South while they engage in peaceful demonstration.
He also joined Dr. King back down south in the fight to get federal protection for Black Americans who were denied the right to vote.
As you know, we are assembled here today to reaffirm our determination to gain the right to vote in Selma, in Dallas County, and all over the state of Alabama.
March 6, 1965.
I was in Atlanta discussing and debating with my colleagues in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Some people said we should march, others said we should not. I took the position that we had been in Selma since 1962. We had been arrested in 63 and 64. The people wanted to march, and we should march.
On Sunday, March 7th.
This march intends to keep off the highway. We will be marching on the shoulder of the road and will not in any way be interfering with the pursuit of traffic.
And the young came and said a prayer. We stood up. We got off our knees and lined up in twos and started walking in an orderly fashion with Jose William and myself leading the walk through the streets of Selma. We get to the edge of the bridge. Jose asked me, he said, "John, can you swim?" I said, "No." I said, "What about you?" He said, "A little." And I said something like, "Well, there's too much water there. We're not going to jump. We're going forward." We continued to walk. We came to the highest point on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Down below, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers. We came within hearing distance of the state troopers.
To be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You are to disperse. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church.
You saw these men putting on their gas masks. The major said, "Troopers, advance."
Troopers here, advance.
They came toward us. Beating us with nightsticks, driving us with horses, releasing the tear gas. I thought I was going to down that bridge. I thought I saw death. 50 years later, I don't recall how I made it back across the bridge, through the streets of Selma, back to the little church.
That brutal confrontation became known as Bloody Sunday. Scholars say the bloody images of that vicious attack helped hasten the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Lewis would go on to hold various leadership roles at several voting rights organizations. In the mid-70s, then President Jimmy Carter appointed him to lead Action, a federal volunteer agency. In 1981, he entered politics, winning a seat on the Atlanta City Council. 5 years later, in 1986, Lewis was elected to serve as a U.S. representative for Georgia's 5th Congressional District, an office he held until his death. In 2015, 50 years after Bloody Sunday, Congressman John Lewis stood on a stage at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. Many gathered to remember those who marched, to retrace the steps of those who gave so much, and to inspire a new generation.
But you and I are here. We can bear witness to the distance we have come and the progress we have made in 50 years, and we must use this moment to recommit ourselves to do all we can to finish the work. There's still work left to be done.
On December 29, 2019, the man who withstood physical attacks and serious injury in the push for civil and human rights announced another big fight. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. Lewis said then that doctors discovered the cancer during a routine visit.
Good morning. Good morning. It is good to be in Selma, Alabama one more time.
And not wanting to disappoint the people who were gathering for the 55th commemoration of Bloody Sunday, Lewis made a surprise appearance in March this year.
On this bridge, some of us gave a little blood to help redeem the soul of America.
In the middle of his own fight for survival, he still found strength to march one more time and inspire the crowd.
So don't get weary. Yes. Keep the faith. Yes. Yes.
And months later, he was there watching as peaceful demonstrations got unruly in Atlanta after the death of George Floyd while in police custody in Minneapolis. Lewis sent this message to anyone thinking about joining the protest.
My message is very simple. If you're going to go out and protest, whether it be a sit-in, a stand-in, a march, a singing, do it in an orderly, peaceful, non-violent fashion, and appeal to the better angels of your fellow human beings. Hate is too heavy a burden to bear, and we must lay it down and not hate anyone. Way of love is a better way.
The way of love is a better way.
Yeah,
the family of John Lewis spoke out today for the first time, and they said that he was a fighter with a tenacious spirit, and he fought Jobita to the very end.
He sure did. His younger brother, Grant, shared a moment that made him smile when he talked about how the congressman didn't get his driver's license until he was in his 40s.
I would drive him around to different places, and I remember he used to tell me, before we get out of the car, be patient, little brother. Every time. I never questioned him. The next time we go somewhere, he would tell me before we open the doors, be patient, little brother. All of a sudden, it dawned on me. We would go into a building to get a loaf of bread or just something, light bulb or something, which should have took 10 minutes max. It would take us 3.5 hours because he would shake every hand, take pictures with everybody that wanted to take pictures. And that's the kind of person my brother was.
A great motto for life, be patient. And the congressman was always gracious and kind-hearted, even as he continued to fight for the rights of people. And Congressman Lewis and I met for an extended one-on-one interview in Selma, Alabama, and we walked the same path that he and others did 50 years earlier. He talked about what was going through his mind as they came face-to-face with officers who prepared to use brutal force to stop the march.
When I see the video of you at the foot of the bridge, you didn't move, you didn't flinch. What were you thinking at that moment when they were coming up to you, when they were screaming at you?
I thought we would be arrested and that we would be taken to jail. I didn't have any idea that we would be beaten, tear gas, and trampled by horses. I was prepared to go to jail. I was wearing a backpack, and in this backpack I had 2 books, 1 apple and 1 orange. I wanted to have something to read and something to eat. I had toothpaste and a toothbrush. I wanted to be able to brush my teeth.
Just 2 days after that 1965 assault on Selma marchers who were demonstrating for voting rights, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and many religious leaders marched to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They prayed there, and that night, a white minister, Reverend James Reeb, was attacked by segregationists. He died from his injuries.
I wish for a moment that we would bow in a word of silent prayer for these brothers who came here to be with us today and who marched with us across the Alabama River, who marched to witness for freedom and to witness for their own personal dedication to the cause of justice.
The brutal violence in Selma was seen around the world. President Lyndon Johnson appeared on television to address the Congress and the nation.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too, because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice.
Days after the president's speech and under the protection of Alabama's National Guard, Dr. King, John Lewis, and thousands of others marched 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery. It took them several days to complete the journey. At the Alabama Capitol, Dr. King delivered his famous "How Long" speech.
I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, yes, sir, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, no, because truth crushed earth will rise again. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. Yes, sir. Because no lie can live forever. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Five months later, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The president gave Dr. King one of the pens he used to sign the bill.
What kind of historic moment was that for you?
When the Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, it was so meaningful. Many of us shouted for joy. And then when President Lyndon Johnson signed that act on August 6, 1965, we said it was worth it. The blood, the beating, the jailing, it was all worth it.
Under the Voting Rights Act, states that had a history of voter discrimination had to get federal approval in order to change their election laws. In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that section of the act was unconstitutional.
When that decision came down, I wanted to cry, because so many people had suffered. Too many people had died. And I wanted to say to some members of the courts that you never had to stand in unmovable lines. You never had to pass a literacy test or count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar. We're going to fix it. We're going to bring members of Congress to Selma, to walk across the bridge, to understand, to feel, to see what happened.
If you have been criticized for one thing, it is that you are too optimistic.
Well, I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic. You have to have this sense of hope, this sense of optimism. To lose hope, it's like you don't exist. You have to have hope and faith to continue to move and to believe that we can make it.
You have to have optimism and hope. Governor Brian Kemp ordered all flags to fly at half-staff on all state buildings and grounds to honor John Lewis. Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms ordered flags to be lowered on City of Atlanta facilities.
Congressman Lewis's death came just as Georgians were mourning the loss of another freedom fighter.
And Jovita, longtime civil rights leader Reverend C.T. Vivian died Friday morning. And as Channel 2's Dave Huddleston explains, just like John Lewis, Vivian began fighting for equal rights at an early age.
I found out that life is in the doing, right? And that's what the movement was about. It was doing things.
The only child of farming parents, Cordy Tyndall Vivian, or CT as we knew him, was born July 30th, 1924 in Boonville, Missouri. His family moved to Illinois in search of a better education for CT. It was in Peoria, Illinois, where he joined the fight for civil rights in 1947, a sit-in, a nonviolent demonstration to end segregation at lunch counters in the city.
Anytime you're present, you've got to do something about the conditions that you're in.
Nearly 10 years would pass before he would meet Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr.
What Martin King was after is that he wrote on the window of SCLC, to redeem the soul of America.
Vivian told us King's ability to inspire convinced him to join King's staff and take on a larger role in the civil rights movement. He organized sit-ins, took part in freedom rides, events that many times landed him and others in jail.
You understood from the get-go that you could be killed at any given moment.
He led a voting rights protest in Selma, Alabama. In what might be considered his defining moment, he confronted Sheriff Jim Clark on the courthouse steps.
I saw the club coming. There was a policeman on each side of him with the club held at each end. And he shot forward. It missed here and hit me right across there, right? And just tore loose all the skin under there. And the blood came down. The blood you see there had come down from underneath.
Vivian, like many others in the movement, said he had no fear of dying.
My wife and I had already come to the conclusion, right, that if I didn't come home from one of the actions, she knew and I knew that we were dependent upon God in the first place. Not to live, but to live decently and right and achieve something worth doing.
A life dedicated to making the world a better place for generations to come.
We did our job so well that they can hardly believe that the world that existed before existed at all.
A job so well done, the nation's first black president paid tribute.
And at 89 years old, Reverend Vivian is still out there, still in the action, pushing us closer to our founding ideals.
In November 2013, President Barack Obama honored Vivian and 15 others with the nation's highest civilian award, the Medal of Freedom.
It was so many years I fought for the freedom movement. So I like the fact that this is an honor of freedom.
An honor fitting for a man who never stopped doing.
You strike me as a man who's never going to stop fighting for what you believe.
Oh, it can't. I mean, I don't know how. Because there's no more single important thing to do than to remove racism from American culture. Not only for me and mine, or just for black people, but for this nation.
Wow. So the pastor who will deliver the eulogy at Reverend Vivian's funeral told us he was a man of action and was always strategizing.
Dr. Gerald Durley said now is the time for all of us to light the torch and continue the work.
C.T. Vivian probably will be larger in death than he was in life because he never sought the limelight. C.T. was always the grassroots organizer out on the march, standing at the Dallas courthouse, working with through Leadership Atlanta, through his basics program, breaking down racial barriers.
He was so busy doing the work. He went on to say Reverend Vivian was serious about uplifting people economically and educationally. And just as Reverend Vivian's friends say that John Lewis was committed to a life of humility and action, and everyone from presidents and lawmakers to civic and religious leaders paid tribute to his legacy.
Channel 2's Richard Elliott talked with former Atlanta Mayor and Ambassador Andrew Young about his friend of 60 years and his determination to get justice.
He's been really a greater impact on this city and on this nation than any of us will ever know.
We talked with former Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young on the front stoop of his Southwest Atlanta home. Few people knew John Lewis better or longer than Mayor Young. They've been friends for nearly 60 years. Young credits John Lewis with getting him back to Atlanta and into the civil rights movement. Together, they worked with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on social justice causes throughout the country. Mayor Young says Lewis had a unique drive to seek justice wherever he could and had it ever since he first saw young John Lewis on the campus of Fisk University.
I was really impressed. This young man has been single-minded in his purpose to pursue the freedom and dignity that America owes to all of its citizens, for all of its citizens. And it's that single-mindedness with humility and courage that makes John Lewis one of the living saints of our time.
Others are remembering John Lewis too, and on both sides of the political aisle. His longtime friend, former Republican Senator Johnny Isakson, who famously hugged Lewis on the floor of the House, said this, quote, "I am terribly saddened by the loss of a great man. His legacy and the lessons he leaves behind have touched us all. I will miss you, my friend." Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms tweeted, "John Lewis loved unconditionally and called upon all of us to be better versions of ourselves." Governor Brian Kemp said, quote, "John Lewis changed our world in profound and immeasurable ways." Congressman David Scott tweeted, quote, "He took his fight for justice and equality for all from the depths of Bloody Sunday to the halls of Congress." Mayor Young says his friend will best be remembered for his power and his humility.
But for me, he will be remembered for the power. You don't usually think of humility and power as going together, but on the floor of the Congress, when John got up, everybody listened because they knew he was speaking from his heart as well as his head, and they knew that he had a kind of uncorruptible integrity that you had to trust.
Mayor Young says he last saw John Lewis last week when it appeared his friend had taken a turn for the worst. But even then, he believed Lewis would endure.
I knew he was weak, but John is such a fighter that I knew that if he had decided that there was something left that nobody could do but him, he would fight to come back. And so I didn't want to believe that when I heard it.
Mayor Young says he got the call of John Lewis's passing from another former Atlanta mayor, Bill Campbell, who had remained close to John Lewis for years. Young says John Lewis always saw the best of what America could be, even if it had to be reminded of it.
Never wavered from his commitment to America and America fulfilling its destiny without violence.
In Atlanta, Richard Elliott, Channel 2 Action News.
He never wavered. And for the children of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it's as if they lost a member of the family. Martin King III told me they've known Lewis all of their lives. They even called him Uncle John.
When you think about what John Lewis meant to the King family, what goes through your mind right now?
The main thing that goes through my mind right this moment is that here was a man who demonstrated unearned suffering, being redemptive. He put his physical self on the line so that we could all achieve the right to vote. I think about how he touched the lives of young people by the thousands and maybe even millions around the world. Because when I saw John Lewis as our congressman, when I was with him, I never saw him ever pass by a group of young people without stopping to say something to him. He never was too busy. He never was too busy for constituents, period. And, you know, he never had any airs about him, never saw himself as better than anyone else. And certainly he very easily could have, you know, because of what he did, the doors that he opened, the sacrifices that he made. But he was always the same way, no matter when you saw him. So, you know, this is really one of our giants in our society. In a real sense, and I might say that he and C.T. Vivian transitioning on the same day. Perhaps they wanted to take their last march on into the Hiverland. And that's, however tragic it is, it's quite interesting that both of them would transition on the same day. So that being their final march for our time. But these were giants. They were truly giants who would not accept no. John Lewis often said, don't give up, don't give in, don't give out. And he demonstrated that. So we have something to embrace. And when you look at the many demonstrations that we see all over our nation and world, they are inspired by John Lewis and what he continued to do throughout his life. It's very sad that in 2020, we're still trying to make sure that people have the right to vote, and voter suppression is a thing of the past. But unfortunately, it's very real, even in our own state.
You said that you called him Uncle John, and it is hard when you lose your family. How are you coping with this?
I don't ever try to use the phrase bittersweet, but that is probably what it more feels like than anything else. I mean, whenever we lose anyone, it's painful. And as I said, to some degree, some might say this is the end of an era, but it also might be a new beginning in other ways. And I think John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, Dr. Lowry, they ran their race, and they ran it extraordinarily well. And it's incumbent upon us to keep this marathon going. It's not a sprint. If it was a sprint, we'd all be resting. It's a marathon. And my mom used to say that every generation has to earn their keep. And I think that's...
And Dr. Bernice King, the daughter of civil rights icon Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., used two words to help describe John Lewis: honor and sacrifice.
She talked about how he truly exemplified the nonviolent movement.
Even though it wasn't a shock, it still evokes tears because you know that they served with such strength, power, and dignity. The legacy of nonviolence was fully on display with John Lewis, and he carried it into the halls of Congress, and he handled himself very well. And so he, there's not going to be another. You don't expect to be another. Everybody needs to be themselves. But it's definitely a void.
And News Drone 2 captured this view of the Hero mural in downtown Atlanta. You can't miss it. The towering 5-story mural pays homage to John Lewis and his decades of service to the people of Georgia. And it is because of his fight. People across Metro Atlanta said they had to stop by the mural to pay their respects. And Channel 2's Audrey Washington talked with those who said there's no better time than the present to stand up for what's right.
The sound of church bells ringing echoed from Peachtree Street, down Edgewood, and finally to here on Auburn Avenue. This at the iconic Congressman John Lewis mural is where so many came to honor and remember the civil rights giant.
John Lewis is my hero.
Outside St. Luke's Church in downtown Atlanta is where I found Denise De La Rue. She stopped everything she was doing to come to the church, hear the bells, and remember John Lewis. He died Friday night at 80 years old after a long, brave battle with pancreatic cancer.
There's so little we can do at a time like this to be together and show tribute, and it seemed like such a lovely gesture, and it's just where I had to be.
Lewis died just a few hours after fellow activist C.T. Vivian passed away. The two, along with so many others, fought for equality, justice, and voter rights. 15-year-old Ashton Zienge says he's grateful.
How we can thrive in these communities and get out and become people like him, become civil rights leaders and activists, and do better in our communities.
Ashton's mother says right now there is sorrow, but also peace. She believes John Lewis fought the good fight and ultimately won.
So it feels like a really big hole, but I do believe that he will still be an angel helping us from heaven.
And clearly this was a passing that touched so many people. I had the pleasure of meeting Congressman Lewis several times. He was very kind, such a gentle soul, but also intentional and a force. What he has done for people will never be forgotten. He will be missed. I'm Audrey Washington in downtown Atlanta.
And we have a rare glimpse at some of Lewis's final moments, conversations, and memories. Channel 2's Nicole Carr spoke with 3 people who were close to the congressman in his final days.
During Lewis's transition, the focus was still on his life's work and love.
I think John's whole world was wrapped up in, we've got to make these wrongs right. He was committed to that from his soul out.
To understand a bit more about John Lewis and the Giants' journey, we took a look at his life, the part that takes him from Atlanta to D.C., through the eyes of 3 people, a handful of the last to witness his final days.
I, for one, just was thinking about all of those things he had done while I'm taking these photos. Just what a moment, what a moment, what a moment.
In the last moments, the last few days, he still was emphasizing how essential it was to vote. And he kept saying, this election is the most important one we'll ever have.
Before Bill Campbell became an Atlanta mayor and before John Lewis represented Georgia's 5th District, a lifelong friendship would be cemented as office mates in Atlanta City Hall. They were a part of a trio that flipped Atlanta City Council to majority African-American leadership in 1981. The group, which would be victorious in their dissent, did not agree with then Mayor Andy Young in the plan to run a 4-lane highway through the neighborhoods surrounding the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. But the uncomfortable discourse never turned ugly with Lewis's close friend Young. Decades later, a modified version of that road would end up bearing Lewis's name. And when Lewis set his sights on D.C. in 1986, he was facing off against another friend who was considered the people's choice, the late Julian Bond.
It was a challenge for all of us because they were such great historical figures. I was the only African-American elected official to support John Lewis in that race. And it was incredibly difficult because there were so many who underestimated the resolve of John Lewis. And if history has taught us anything, Nicole, it is that John Lewis is never to be underestimated.
Miss Clayton, love connection, matchmaker. How did you put these two together?
Well, it was really interesting because, well, Lillian was my best friend.
Renowned activist and media executive Zernona Clayton was in the movement and knew Lewis well, and she wanted her friend Lillian, a lover of languages, travel, and art, to connect with him. So she threw a private dinner party in her home in 1967. Soon after that initial meeting, Lewis spent some time in the hospital, time that would seal the fate of his love life.
When we got there, there was a woman there. And she was adjusting his bed and his pillow, and like she was really making him comfortable. And she said, I don't think I want to be fighting any competition. I said, girl, we don't have to run away from competition. I said, if we like this boy and let's pursue this, I can get rid of the competition.
And so it was done in 1968, the start of a 44-year union, a son named John Miles and Lillian becoming Lewis's chief political defender, among acts of lifelong loyalty until her 2013 death.
But got in there and dug in the trenches and was his best partner.
Let's go back to June, a day after a chemo treatment for Lewis. Before he returned to Atlanta for a final stretch of rest, Lewis's chief of staff contacted this man, D.C. photographer Gary Williams.
It's me and the mayor's photographers there as well. It's only us two documenting this.
Lewis making a quick trip to Black Lives Matter Plaza. Williams capturing photos of what would be the icon's last public appearance.
A couple people help him up the steps, and give him his cane. And everybody kind of just steps back and lets him, have a moment. It was hard to see his facial expression just because he had the mask on, but you could see in his eyes that it was a moment of reflection for him. You could see that he was thinking. And I kept saying to myself, I wonder what he's thinking. To have done the work that he's done, to have fought the fights that he fought, to have been beaten within inches of his life, the Bloody Sunday, Selma, to think of the work that they all did to make this moment possible.
I can't emphasize enough that if we want to pay tribute to John Lewis and C.T. Vivian and Joseph Lowry and Andy Young and all of the unspoken heroes, it is to go and vote. Nothing is more fundamental and nothing is more revolutionary.
I've been telling children these last couple of days that I hope you're watching everything that's on the television. God made the supreme gift to all of us, and that was life. And the least we can do is pay back that gift by leading a good life. And John did.
Stay with us as we celebrate Atlanta's freedom fighters. We are going to hear from young activists about their plan to continue the legacy. We'll be right back.
It doesn't matter whether we're black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. It doesn't matter whether we're straight or gay. We're one people, we're one family. We all live in the same house.
And welcome back as we celebrate Atlanta's freedom fighters, fathers of the movement. Well, the Center for Civil and Human Rights in downtown Atlanta sits in Congressman John Lewis's district. He wanted to make sure the struggle for civil rights was not forgotten.
Channel 2's anchor Lori Wilson spoke with the center's president about the loss of 3 civil rights leaders.
When you lose the eyewitnesses, you lose something profound, because these people can testify from experience.
CEO and president of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, Jill Savitt, says the passing of civil rights icons Dr. Joseph Lowry, Reverend C.T. Vivian, and Congressman John Lewis should cause us all to redouble our determination to see an end to racism and inequality in our country.
The world needs to know civil rights history perhaps more than ever.
The center sits in the heart of John Lewis's 5th district. There's even a John Lewis Fellows program. The congressman did a welcome for the most recent class in 2019.
Thank you for standing up.
Inside the civil rights exhibit, the March on Washington is well documented. Little Ruby Bridges and the story of school integration. Also a lunch counter where our cameras on opening day saw a John Lewis overwhelmed by memories.
Throughout this whole center has his spirit, and he was so moved he cried. Just, you could see him going back in time to that moment.
Savitt says what makes Dr. Lowry, Vivian, and Lewis so indelible is that their story is not just about a moment. It's about a lifetime of work dedicated to improving the human condition.
We got to see these human rights activists when they were very young and fiery, and how it's a marathon.
The March on Washington, that pivotal moment in 1963 that led to the passage of the National Civil Rights Act, was a victory. But for Lowry, Vivian, and Lewis, it was still just a beginning. Lewis, the last living speaker from the March on Washington, now gone.
None of them gave up. And all of them were instrumental in helping us build this center, because they knew that people would forget, that memories would fade, that their generation would pass. And so it's now here in glass and brick and stone, and it will be here for as long as possible, because this history is not only history, it's about this moment.
A movement that has recently been defined by protests calling for police reform and an end to racial violence.
It's such a patriotic movement that is rooted in love of country. And I think some people think, oh, he was an African-American leader, or the civil rights story is an African-American story. It is fundamentally an American story, the most American story, of people who love democracy so much that they want to see its promises fulfilled.
Promises that many would die before seeing come to pass. But Lowry, Vivian, and Lewis, they endured, and they kept working and fighting for justice until the end.
And I think there was an enormous weight for those who did. But you look at Reverend Lowry, and there's now a Lowry Institute that is training young people. And you look at C.T. Vivian, and his children have gone on to continue the movement. And so there is a through line through history. And we got to see what it looks like when you stick to it for the long haul.
With the deaths of these 3 freedom fighters, many ask who will carry the baton now. Channel 2's Tom Jones spoke to 3 community leaders under the age of 30 who say they will continue the fight for equality.
Congressman John Lewis was one of the lions of the civil rights movement, so it is fair to say
police brutality will end in this generation.
These are some of the young cubs.
His life was a roadmap of what so many young people in the streets now should want to attain to be.
Never, ever give up.
Who are following in Lewis's giant footsteps.
When I look at what his life's work was, it in many regards reminds me of the work that we have to do today.
And the murderers of Breonna Taylor.
I've been watching these three young people under the age of 30 work in the community. The Reverend James Woodall was elected president of the Georgia NAACP at 25. He has been involved in advocating for the poor and underserved, those who are powerless to fight power. As he works, Woodall remembers the foundation laid by Lewis.
For Congressman Lewis, for me, how we continue in that work is to ensure that every single Georgian has access to the ballot box, to ensure that we have clean water in our communities, especially here in the heart of Atlanta.
And I think that he touched the hearts of so many young people.
Mary Pat Hector is a dedicated community advocate working to combat gun violence and ending hunger. She even ran for city council at 21. Hector is a fervent believer in young people voting and getting involved in the political process.
One of the things that I plan on committing to continue his work is to support and help young people like John Lewis who are passionate about changing the world, run for office and win.
They set the foundation for us.
Give God some praise.
Reverend Jared Sawyer Jr. is an internationally known minister and author.
No justice!
He was active in recent protests around the city, adding a sense of calm when he was on the scene. He and others say calm is good, but as Lewis often said, sometimes you have to get in the way and stay in the way.
There's so much vigor, spirit, strength, selflessness. My generation has accepted or has refused to accept the status quo.
They all are tireless workers in the fight for justice and a more perfect place for us all to live. They refuse to stay silent.
And that was a lesson that I learned from John Lewis. That you don't have the luxury nor the privilege of staying silent when there is injustice, because in the words of Dr. King, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Tom Jones, Channel 2 Action News.
Stay with us as we celebrate Atlanta's freedom fighters. A look at the legacy of Reverend Joseph Lowry right after this. Joseph Lowry spoke at President Obama's inauguration back in 2009.
And we lost Reverend Lowry, who was often called the dean of the civil rights movement, on March 27th.
Joseph Eccles Lowry was born October 6, 1921 in Huntsville, Alabama. It was in Alabama Lowry began his lifelong work in the civil rights movement. He was among the leaders of the Montgomery bus boycott, which was held after Rosa Parks' arrest in 1955. Just a few years later, he and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1977, Lowry became its president.
We believe in nonviolence. We believe in analysis and communication and negotiation. And as a last resort, we believe in nonviolent direct action.
Lowry carried on King's dream, participating in peaceful protest around the country for justice and equality.
We believe at rock bottom that the solution to our problems are moral.
Jesus, who's my wheel in the middle of a wheel. Ah, he's my shining star. He's my star of Jacob.
From the pulpit, while Lowry preached about God and salvation, his sermons also challenged leaders to end poverty and war. For 14 years, Lowry served as pastor of Atlanta's Cascade United Methodist Church. He retired in 1990 and in 1998 stepped down as president of the SCLC.
It's been a great journey. The old spiritual said I wouldn't take nothing from a journey now. But I think it's time and I'm not leaving the movement. I want to make that clear. I can intend to raise hell.
Sit down before I take up an offering.
True to his word, Lowry continued his activism. In 2006, he was once again in the spotlight for the political comments he made at the funeral of his dear friend, Coretta Scott King.
We know now there were no weapons of mass destruction over there. But Coretta knew, and we know, that there are weapons of misdirection right down here. Millions without health insurance. Poverty abounds. For war, billions more, but no more for the poor. We ask you to help us work for that day.
In 2008, Lowry played a prominent role in the election of Barack Obama as the country's first African-American president. Lowry endorsed Mr. Obama early in the campaign and delivered a soul-stirring benediction at the historic inauguration.
Help us to make choices on the side of love, not hate. On the side of inclusion, not exclusion. Tolerance, not intolerance. And as we leave this mountaintop, help us to hold on to the spirit of fellowship.
Reverend Joseph E. Lowry.
Among all the prestigious awards and degrees bestowed upon Lowry for his civil rights work, one of his proudest moments came when he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in August 2009 from President Obama. It is the highest honor given to a U.S. citizen and part of a remarkable journey for a man who often referred to himself as just a small-town country preacher.
I'm grateful. I've lived to see so many things come to pass that I never dreamed I would live to see.
A life well lived. The Freedom Riders were an essential part of the civil rights movement, and black and white riders rode buses through the South to protest segregated bus terminals. And the rides were violent at times. But those who knew John Lewis during the earliest days of the civil rights movement say he was fearless like no other.
Channel 2's Barrett Peterson talked with a Metro business leader who stood shoulder to shoulder with Lewis during one trip that changed the country.
Hank Thomas says his friend John Lewis was half his size, but had twice the courage of almost anybody. And together, they took part in a crusade that changed the nation. When Hank Thomas looks back on the life and times of America over the last 60 years, he's learned that American heroes come in all shapes and sizes.
He was very quiet, soft-spoken individual. Physically, he was a small person.
Memories of his friend, John Lewis. One of the Congressman's first battles for equal rights was with the legendary Freedom Riders, the courageous group that rode Greyhound and Trailways buses through the South beginning in 1961, challenging segregation on interstate transportation and at bus and train station bathrooms and lunch counters, and standing up to angry mobs along the way.
I was very impressed or depressed with his sense of, with his bravery. He had no fear.
Thomas saw it with his own eyes. He was there, one of the original 13 Freedom Riders, changers of history. And he says when the next generation reads the history of John Lewis, he would add this about his old friend.
Quiet, unassuming, until you got to his favorite topic, which was winning freedom and justice for black people.
Reporting in Midtown Atlanta, Barrett Peterson, Channel 2 Action News.
We thank you for spending this hour with us to celebrate the lives of Atlanta's freedom fighters, to recognize the contributions they made to the civil rights movement and to our country.
We invite you to visit WSB-TV.com for extensive coverage of their legacies, and stay with us throughout the next several days as we learn more about their homegoing plans.
And for now, we leave you with images from throughout the years of Reverend Vivian, Reverend Lowry, and Congressman Lewis. Have a good evening.